For all its beauty and splendor, the sea can be a cruel teacher. The sea gives and the sea takes, and the man who chases fish into its belly knows both. The sea will let you feel glory, then roll you under like driftwood. One crack of weather, one snapped line, one heartbeat of bad luck, and you'll be flung against rock or pulled below. Men die out there, and the sea remembers none of them. Still, we go. Because in the pull of the tide and the salt in the air, there's something that calls the stubborn and the dreaming. Deep sea fishing is not for the tame. It is for those who are willing to risk being swallowed by what they love. Let's venture back to the savage seas where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. For Joseph Rangel, Lorenzo Madrid, and Jose Pepe Garcia, their Sea of Cortez fishing trip would be a nightmare. In late September 2000, lifelong friends Joe Rangel and Lorenzo Madrid, both 50-year-old Southern Californians, set out on a dream fishing trip deep into the Sea of Cortez. Rangel was an electrician and Vietnam veteran who considered himself a rugged outdoorsman. Madrid was a leathery, jovial drugstore manager from Malibu, a man who loved the ocean. Together since childhood, they had sailed the California coastline but never experienced anything like what was planned for them. A 5-day charter in Baja's famous midriff waters aboard the mothership Celia Angelina. The plan was simple. On September 30th, they would board the Celia Angelina in San Felipe, Mexico, a converted 87-foot shrimp trawler with bunks and galleys for anglers. This was no luxury cruise. Known as a poor man's long-range trip, it promised big-game fishing in remote, fertile waters at a fraction of the price, roughly $700 for nearly a week at sea. For serious Southern California fishermen like Joe and Lorenzo, it was the kind of trip worth waiting for. The mission: sail 15 hours south from the port of San Felipe to the Midriff Islands, a rugged, sparsely inhabited chain that slices through the northern Sea of Cortez like a serrated edge. Once there, she'd anchor and serve as a floating base camp, while smaller skiffs, or pangas, ferried groups of 2 or 3 anglers and a guide out each day to fish the volcanic reefs and rocky coastlines in pursuit of yellowtail, grouper, and sea bass. The vessel would steam down to Isla Angel de la Guarda, a 40-mile-long desert isle in the northern Sea of Cortez. Sea of Cortez charters like these promise trophy fish, remote adventure, and memories to last a lifetime. The men eagerly imagined hauling in record fish and trading war stories over beer on deck. On a clear morning, Rangel and Madrid set off from San Felipe. At first, everything seemed perfect. The Celia Angelina glided south on gentle seas. Excitement and laughter filled the cabin as anglers shared stories of monster marlin. By all accounts, the first few days were everything they'd hoped for. Warm sun, cool wind, and fat fish bending rods to the breaking point. The Gulf of California was at its best this time of year. Warm tropical currents collided with Pacific upwellings, stirring nutrients into vast schools of baitfish and attracting giant game fish. But the midriff region, though rich in marine life, is as unforgiving as it is beautiful. It is empty, vast, and remote. Villages are scarce, and communications nearly non-existent. Bahia de Los Angeles, the nearest outpost, had just 2 working phones in 2000. The region was notorious for sudden squalls and rough seas. Southern Baja was wild country, remote islands with no villages, scorching days and cold nights, and only the occasional scientific expedition or fishermen visiting these unpopulated shores. And by early October, the weather in the Sea of Cortez becomes moody. Winds shift without warning. The sea, glassy one hour, can turn savage the next. Still, Rangel and Madrid believed in their preparations. They had life jackets and a cell phone, plenty of provisions, and the company of the dependable young Pepe. By the 3rd day, on October 3rd, the Celia anchored in a northerly bay of Isla Angel de la Guarda. All aboard rested, ate well, and prepared gear. Joe and Lorenzo savored a late dinner of ceviche made from the day's catch, thinking, tomorrow, they'll fish the west side. But they had no idea that the next day, disaster would strike. The trip they'd carefully planned would descend into something far darker than any of them imagined. By the afternoon of October 4th, 2000, the Celia Angelina lay anchored in a calm bay at the northern end of Isla Angel de la Guarda. Meanwhile, Wrangel and Madrid were drifting far from her protective shadow, fishing the exposed western edge of the island in an open, 22-foot skiff with their guide, Jose Pepe Garcia. Then the wind came, rising like a beast from nowhere, curling over the waves and twisting their path into disorientation. Garcia, just 25 and rattled by the sudden shift, lost his bearings. The skiff spun with the gusts, and for hours the three men drifted aimlessly along the island's darkening coastline. The Celia Angelina was nowhere in sight. The sun dropped low, and with it, their chances. The fuel gauge crept toward empty. If the engine died out there, they'd be at the mercy of the current, swept into open sea, beyond rescue. The thought hung heavy in the boat. "We still have gas. We land now, or we drift forever," Joe proclaimed. Pepe nodded. They had no real choice, but the coast offered no safe welcome. Only jagged black rock, surf boiling against stone, and the roar of waves crashing in the dark. They turned the boat toward shore. In the growing night, the cliffs vanished into shadow. All they could see were the ghost-white flashes of breakers smashing into the coast. The motor strained, pushing them forward. Then came the crash. The skiff slammed into the rocks with violent force, throwing all three men overboard. Gear flew, water surged over them, salt and stone tore at their skin, but they made it. Sputtering and gasping, they pulled themselves up onto the craggy shore, shaken but alive. The boat, somehow, had survived the impact too. Still, they were in the worst place imaginable. The island's western coast was a brutal wilderness, untouched, unseen, and completely cut off. The Celia Angelina was anchored far on the other side of the 40-mile island. No one could see them. No one knew they were there. There were no eyes on them, no backup, no lifeline, no fuel, and no radio. Like many skiff operators in that region, Garcia had no communication gear, no flares, no distress signal, nothing. When the wind hit, they were as good as invisible. They had escaped the worst. None was injured beyond cuts and bruises. Quickly, they unloaded the skiff. Joe grabbed the ice chest off the stern. Lorenzo carried out the cooler lid and scattered whatever washed up inside it. 4 small bottles of water and 1 can of soda were left inside, plus the beers that had been in the ice. Wrangel also gathered gear: rods and the tackle box, a pocket knife, and the lighter he had in a zippered pocket. The 3 men scrambled to higher ground at the end of the rocky strip. Here, the men would camp for the night. They made a fire in hopes of being rescued by morning, and made the best of it. They sat around the fire, drank beer, and were in good spirits, given the circumstances. But inside them all was a growing dread. "We're on our own out here," Joe thought. The island's warning name, Guardian Angel, no longer felt reassuring. Meanwhile, when the skiff fails to return by nightfall, the Celia Angelina's crew realizes something is wrong. Owner Bob Castellone dispatches 2 other skiffs to search the vicinity for the missing fishermen. One search skiff damages a propeller on rocks, and the initial search is called off in the darkness with no sign of the missing party. Castellone then radios for help and alerts authorities that Wrangel, Madrid, and their guide are missing at sea. By dawn of October 5th, the gale had diminished to a breezy chop, but the storm's damage was done. They were stranded on an uninhabited desert island with temperatures rising into the high 90s and hundreds. Joe, Lorenzo, and Pepe stared out into the sea, hoping to spot the mothership or any passing boats looking for them. Even if they could contact the Celia Angelina by radio, nobody knew exactly where the skiff had gone. Pepe closed his eyes and shook his head. He said, "They don't know we're here." He meant that they had strayed west of the ship's usual fishing area. The words hit them like a hammer. Then Pepe spoke softly. "We must survive. We must reach help." So the stranded men had to come up with a plan. Joe stared at the nearly empty bottles and their meager provisions. They had to do something. First, a desperate idea. Try to swim or paddle to the Baja mainland. The nearest bit of peninsula was still at least 30 miles away, beyond the island's northern tip. Unshakable, Pepe volunteered to test the waters. "I'll try to swim," he said. Rangel grabbed Pepe's shoulder. "Are you out of your mind?" "That's suicide," he stated. Pepe only managed a weak grin and shrugged. But Rangel knew Pepe was strong and at home on the sea, having grown up swimming in the Sea of Cortez. Rangel swallowed his objections. "Promise to wave if you need help," Rangel shouted after him as the younger man waded into the surf, sun glinting off his shoulders. For hours, Rangel and Madrid paced the rocks and sand, watching that distant figure shrink. They kept time by the sun's passage. Lorenzo rubbed his hands together for warmth as he waited and watched. Around midday, Rangel thought he saw Pepe's silhouette wobble far to the north, a head rising and falling on the swell, but later he would realize it was a mirage. After what felt like eternity, Pepe staggered back onto the beach just as it began to drizzle. He coughed up salt water and collapsed on the pebbles. Each man gasped when they saw the bloodshot eyes. "I saw everything. A shark circled me. I had to fight off a sea lion too," Pepe gasped. He gave a small, bitter laugh. "The ocean is angry now, not a friend." Joe helped him to the fire. They poured their quickly diminishing water between them. None of them slept that night. Meanwhile, Mexican authorities and volunteers initiate a wide-scale search. Over the coming days, dozens of vessels and aircraft, including Mexican Coast Guard ships, local fishing boats, and small planes, scour the area. Searches extend along the Baja coast, nearby islands, and the open Gulf, operating under the theory that the skiff may have drifted east toward the mainland. Unbeknownst to rescuers, the men are actually stuck on Isla Ángel de la Guarda's west side, often hidden from view by cliffs and caves. The day after Pepe's return brought a hard reckoning. The motor was dead. No fuel, no power, no hope of outrunning the sea. But there was driftwood, sun-bleached, splintered, and floating like the bones of forgotten ships. They gathered it and turned their skiff into a crude raft. If the sea wouldn't carry them to safety, they would muscle their way across it. Their plan was desperate but clear. Paddle north along the island's shore, staying within sight of land, but hoping, praying that the Celia Angelina would spot them or that some passing boat might appear like salvation on the horizon. They bailed the last of the stagnant water from the hull, adjusted what supplies they had, and pushed off. The moment the skiff left the rocky cove, they were at war with the water. The paddling was brutal. Each stroke felt like digging a grave. The sun above was a white eye that never blinked, and though the sea breeze whispered promises of relief, the heat still clawed at their backs like fire. Their hands blistered, their muscles trembled, but they kept going. Then, hope. A boat appeared in the distance, small against the jagged edge of sea and sky. They stood, flailing their arms, screaming until their throats cracked. For a moment the boat seemed to turn. Then it didn't. The figures on board, if they saw them at all, looked right through them. And the boat motored off, vanishing like a mirage. Evening came like a weight. The men collapsed in the skiff, their limbs heavy, their minds blurred with thirst and disappointment. They passed out beneath the darkening sky, unaware the tide was betraying them. By nightfall, the sea dragged them backward like prey. Waves surged beneath them, steering the skiff toward the unforgiving island shore. Without warning, the skiff slammed into jagged rocks. Wood splintered, bags scattered, bodies thrashed. Joe and Pepe clawed their way up the beach. Lorenzo was not so lucky. In the chaos, he had fallen hard, spraining both ankles. By morning, the sun was back, merciless, white-hot and watching. They took stock of their condition, and the reality hit like a punch to the gut. Rangel, a type 2 diabetic, was running dangerously low on energy and hydration, his condition silently threatening to turn fatal. He had no insulin, no monitoring, and the island offered nothing but salt and sun. Both men were overweight, their bodies not built for endurance or extreme heat. But Lorenzo, obese and years removed from any doctor's visit, was in worse shape. He couldn't walk, he couldn't even stand, and they still had no way to call for help. It was then that the truth settled in. No one was coming. If they were going to survive, they had to rescue themselves. the skiff was wrecked. The food was nearly gone, and the heat wasn't letting up. So they came up with a plan to hike north, along the savage coast of Isla Ángel de la Guarda, 40 miles of burning rock, knife-edge cliffs, and unforgiving terrain. No trail, no map, just survival on foot, with the ocean at their side and death on their heels. A decision that would either save them or kill them. Despite the pain radiating from his sprained ankles and the weight of exhaustion dragging at his every step, Lorenzo Madrid pressed forward. With Jose Pepe Garcia and Joseph Rangel beside him, he hobbled along the rocky, sun-blasted coastline of Isla Ángel de la Guarda. The sun bore down like judgment, punishing each movement, peeling skin and hope alike. But the men pushed on, because to stop was to die, and they all knew it. Then came the roadblock. The shoreline they followed ended abruptly. The island's jagged cliffs pinched inward, forming a narrow channel that carved through the rock, a chasm of fast-moving water separating them from the only path forward. There was no going around, no way back. It was cross or perish. The three men stood at the edge, staring down at the water, breathing hard, their minds grinding through the risk. Then Pepe stepped forward and jumped in first. The men on the shore watched in tense silence as he swam across with ease and reached the opposite shore. Lorenzo was next. His legs were weak, his ankles ruined, but something burned in him, some primal refusal to be left behind. Without hesitation, Lorenzo jumped into the water, and made it as well. But Joe stood frozen. He wasn't a strong swimmer, never had been. The idea of throwing himself into that water felt like suicide. His feet refused to move. His chest tightened. His legs buckled. The other men yelled at him to jump in, but still, he was frozen. Then he heard it. "Don't be a sissy." Lorenzo's voice cut through the roar of the channel. Sharp, stinging, and familiar. It wasn't mockery. It was the voice of an old friend, a brother in arms, the kind of challenge they'd thrown at each other since the beginning. Joe stared at the water. He knew this might be it. But if he was going to die, he wasn't going to do it standing still. He jumped. He swam like his life depended on it because it did. And then he touched stone. He clawed his way up the opposite bank, soaked, shaking, but alive. They had crossed the first line death had drawn for them, and the island wasn't finished yet. That night, the three men collapsed onto the jagged shore of Isla Ángel de la Guarda, scraped, sun-scorched, and utterly spent. They were out of food and water, and nearly out of time. As they sat around the flames, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy. Each man stared into the fire, but their minds were miles away, drifting to the families they feared they'd never see again. The dawn came too soon, blinding and merciless. There was no dew to drink, no clouds to block the sun, just another day in the furnace. Still, they pushed forward, scraping themselves up and resuming their crawl north. Lorenzo was barely moving. Each step sent knives through his ankles. The skin on his feet was shredded. His body, already pushed past its limits, was beginning to shut down. At last, his legs gave out, and he collapsed on the ground, unable to go on. Joe and Pepe stopped. Time hung still. The question neither wanted to ask now stood before them. Do we stay and risk dying together? Or leave Lorenzo behind and go for help? Then Pepe, ever the problem solver, scanned the shoreline. His eyes locked on a pile of driftwood tangled in seaweed and garbage. He said nothing at first, just walked over and started working, binding pieces together with lengths of discarded rope, tattered fishing line, and strips of fabric from their ruined gear. In less than an hour, he had built something, rough, crude, but functional, a makeshift raft to tow Lorenzo. They gently laid Lorenzo across it, easing his weight onto the wood. It wasn't comfort, but it was a way forward. Lorenzo was grateful, but the truth was, his body was betraying him. The heat was no longer just uncomfortable, it was killing him. His heart pounded under the strain, sweat no longer forming, his breathing shallow and labored. Obesity, dehydration, and pain were all converging like predators in the sand. They had no water, nothing but the salt wind and the endless sun. They found washed-up water bottles on the coast. Joe picked it up, twisted the cap and sniffed. The inside smelled foul, but there was liquid, barely a few gulps. They passed it between them like treasure, warm, murky, sour, but life. They moved forward, dragging Lorenzo through the shallows, but even in the water, he couldn't cool down. He was on top of the raft, unable to feel relief. Then, hope, a glint in the rocks ahead, fishing line, a tackle box, but as they drew closer, dread set in. It was their own gear, the same box, the same lures, the exact spot where days ago they had first washed ashore. Everything fell silent. The waves, the wind, even the gulls above seemed to stop their cries. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Hours of agony, of dragging themselves through hell only to return to the mouth of it. They were demoralized and running out of time. After an overnight at the original site, they still pushed on with Lorenzo on the raft. The survivors pressed northward, dragging their battered bodies along the unforgiving terrain, clinging to hope with frayed hands. It had been more than a week since they'd become stranded on Isla Ángel de la Guarda. 7 days of relentless heat, dwindling strength, and creeping despair. They were still alone, still unseen. What they didn't know was that the search teams, planes, boats, and radio calls were scouring the wrong places. Rescuers focused their efforts on the eastern coastline and the open sea, operating on the assumption that the men had drifted away in the skiff. No one imagined they were still trapped on the island's desolate western face. To make matters worse, the terrain forced the men to veer inland at times, winding through the dark shadows of towering cliffs and dry ravines. From above, they vanished into the rock. Even if a search plane passed overhead, they would have been little more than ants crawling across a landscape that swallowed everything in silence. They were sunburned, scraped raw, and growing thinner by the hour. Clothes hung from their frames, faces sagged with hunger and thirst. Yet somehow, they kept each other moving after nearly 2 weeks stranded on the island. But Lorenzo was slipping. Hour after punishing hour, they pushed forward. Joe Wrangle, who had shown grit and resolve through the worst of it, was beginning to falter. Days earlier, he had slipped on jagged rocks in the shallows. Now deep gashes marred his leg, festering and swollen. Infection had set in. The pain was constant, pulsing with every heartbeat. He knew it was a race against time, and his time was running out. Still, they pressed on, dragging Lorenzo behind on the raft. His body was limp, his face slack, but he was alive, barely. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. In previous nights, they'd managed to stave off the cold with thanks to a lighter they'd miraculously kept dry. But on this night, the spark was gone. The lighter was broken. They huddled together in the sand, trembling, clinging to body heat. Each morning brought new agony, but also a new will. Even now, on the brink of death, they refused to stop. Lorenzo had grown quieter, slipping in and out of lucidity. His skin was ghostly, his words slurred. The dehydration had hollowed him out, turning his mind into a spinning compass. Then one morning, in a haze of confusion, he tried to switch places with Joe, insisting he pull the raft instead. He mumbled about switching turns, about being the strong one now, but he wasn't. He was dying. His mind was gone. His body was not far behind. But Joe had no idea, and they switched. Later, Joe heard a gurgle. He turned and saw Lorenzo's lifeless body floating in the water. Joe rushed to his side, heart pounding. They rushed him ashore, shook him, screamed his name, and checked for a pulse. There was nothing. Lorenzo Madrid, friend, fighter, survivor, was gone. After nearly 2 weeks stranded in a desert of heat and stone, his body had finally given out. Joe sat beside him, paralyzed. The guilt was immediate. So was the grief. But there was no time for either. They laid Lorenzo gently on the shore, positioning his body in the open, hoping some passing boat might see him. A silent marker of tragedy, of sacrifice. Then Joe and Pepe did the only thing they could. They kept going. After another night of rest, They continued. By now, both were ghosts of themselves, skin hanging loose, eyes sunken. Wrangel, a diabetic, should not have made it past day 4 without medical care, but somehow, he kept walking. He could feel the thirst gnawing at his organs. The infection in his leg pulsed like fire. Yet something drove him onward, something heavier than pain, the need to survive for Lorenzo and see his family again, to carry the story of his friend home. Then, a voice. Pepe froze. He pointed ahead. "Did you see that?" "A boat," he whispered, his voice cracked and fragile. Joe strained to see, but nothing appeared. Pepe didn't wait. He took off swimming toward the rocky beach, leaving Joe behind, wondering if this would be the moment they split forever, if he would be left to die alone. Then came the sound, a low hum, mechanical, growing louder. Joe turned his head and saw it, a fishing boat, and on it, Pepe waving frantically. The impossible had happened. 2 fishermen, scouring the waters for no one in particular, had spotted Pepe waving from the rocks. They pulled him aboard, got the story in fragments, then raced back to retrieve Joe. After 13 days of agony, hunger, thirst, infection, heat, loss, and grief, Joe Wrangel was saved. The fishermen radioed for help. The Celia Angelina, which had finally returned to the area after days of searching, picked up the transmission. She was nearby, close enough to reach them quickly. Rescue was no longer a dream. It was real. Moments later, the mothership arrived and pulled alongside the shore where Wrangel and Garcia waited, sunburned and skeletal. Strong hands lifted them aboard. There were no words at first, just gasps, weeping, and the hollow-eyed relief of men who had stared into death and somehow turned away. Lorenzo Madrid was not among the living. Had he survived one more day, he would have been rescued. His body, now frail and still, was gently recovered and wrapped for the journey home. Though he hadn't made it, he would not be left behind. That evening, the Celia Angelina turned her bow toward the Baja mainland, bound for Puertecitos, south of San Felipe. On board were survivors and a fallen friend. The sea that had nearly claimed them now carried them home. When Wrangel's family received the news, disbelief gave way to tears. After nearly 2 weeks of silence, after preparing for the worst, they heard the impossible. Joe was alive. After 13 long days lost to heat, hunger, and heartbreak, the ordeal was over. But none of them would ever be the same. Joe Wrangel bounced back physically after a short stay in a San Diego hospital for dehydration, infected wounds, and heat exposure. Though his body began healing within days, the emotional toll ran deeper. He suffered vivid anxiety and acute stress, admitting he forced himself to stay awake on the boat ride home, terrified he'd wake up back in the island's nightmare. Interviews in the aftermath revealed survivors' guilt and grief over the loss of his friend Lorenzo Madrid. Pepe Garcia, the 25-year-old guide, returned to San Felipe in good health, displaying remarkable resilience after surviving 2 harrowing weeks. Wrangel credited him for his tireless efforts to keep them alive. Garcia, questioned briefly by authorities, defended his guiding experience and was not found at fault. Though he spoke little publicly, likely to avoid the spotlight, his strength and presence were vital throughout the ordeal. The trauma he endured, witnessing death, battling exhaustion, and facing starvation, was immense, though little is reported about his mental recovery. Lorenzo Madrid's story ended in heartbreak. On the 12th day, his body gave out, overwhelmed by dehydration, injury, and exhaustion. The loss was devastating to his family and to Wrangel, who watched his childhood friend fade in front of him. Lorenzo's wife, Janice, endured agonizing days of uncertainty before his body was recovered. While his death left a permanent wound, the return of his body brought a degree of closure, allowing his loved ones to mourn and honor him. His name endures as a tragic figure in one of the most harrowing survival stories in the Sea of Cortez. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Mexican authorities launched an investigation through the San Felipe Police and the Baja California State Prosecutor's Office and reviewed the conduct of the charter operation behind the Celia Angelina. Several safety concerns came under scrutiny. Pepe Garcia, though praised for his efforts, was not a professionally licensed sport fishing captain. Rangel later harshly criticized the charter company, saying the disaster could have been avoided if the owner, Bob Castellon, had provided basic safety equipment. Authorities examined whether Madrid's death could be attributed to negligence, investigating if there were delays, and whether the vessel was adequately equipped for emergencies. Investigators briefly impounded the Celia Angelina and interviewed the crew. Castellon, while emotionally devastated, denied wrongdoing, claiming nothing had indicated their exact location during the search. In the end, no criminal charges were reported. The incident was ruled a tragic accident, made worse by poor safety practices and unpredictable weather. Though there was public speculation about lawsuits, particularly from Lorenzo Madrid's family, no legal action was reported. Rangel, while vocal in his anger, seemed more focused on accountability than litigation. He hoped speaking out might prevent future tragedies. The Celia Angelina continued operating after the incident, but the shadow of what happened lingered and served as a stark warning to all who underestimated the sea. Joe Rangel eventually settled back into the rhythm of everyday life, though whether he ever returned to the water remains uncertain. When asked shortly after his rescue if he'd ever fish the Midriff Islands again, he paused, then replied with a weary smile, "Probably not, but don't hold me to that." Perhaps in time he found peace beside calmer waters, casting a line from the shore, quietly remembering how quickly the ocean can turn and how survival changes everything. He will never forget those 2 weeks on Isla Ángel de la Guarda. But more than the suffering, he remembers the strength. 3 men, stranded in the cruel heart of nowhere, didn't give in. They pushed forward when their bodies begged them to stop. They shared what little they had. They lifted each other, mentally, physically, spiritually, because when everything else was gone, all they had left was each other. In those 2 relentless weeks, he discovered that when life pushes you to the very edge, the human will to survive and the depth of compassion we hold for one another have no limits. But the trauma had left its mark with the passing of his dear friend. Joe and Lorenzo were best friends, fishing partners, family in everything but blood. Since they were 14 years old, they had stood shoulder to shoulder, on boats, on shorelines, in life. Lorenzo Madrid left a crater in the heart of the man who survived him. His voice, his jokes, the stubborn way he refused to quit, it all echoed in Joe's memory. Lorenzo wasn't forgotten. He never could be. In every way that mattered, they were brothers. Survival here is not about courage, it is about rot, about thirst so sharp it shreds your thoughts, about dragging your cracked feet across blistered rock, hunting for water like a dog with its nose to the ground. There are no rescuers on the horizon, no footprints but your own. You learn quickly that the body is soft and the island is not. It has teeth, jagged cliffs, searing heat, biting insects, and nights so cold they burn. You sleep in dirt, speak to stones, and eat what doesn't kill you. But the worst part isn't the hunger or the heat or the pain, it's the waiting. Yet somehow you move, one foot, then the next, not because you believe, but because instinct still gnaws in your bones. That's how survival works out there. You don't rise like a hero, you crawl, broken and half-blind, and pray the island doesn't decide it wants to keep you. Because it can. No one truly knows what lives inside them, not until survival stops being a story and starts being your reality. You might think, I could never do what they did. You pray you'll never have to. You believe your life will stay within the bounds of comfort, far from the teeth of disaster. But life doesn't ask for permission. One day, without warning, it might corner you, strip you bare, throw you into the wilderness and see what you're really made of. And that day will be brutal. You'll be terrified. You'll cry out for help that doesn't come. You'll beg for God's mercy. Your body will ache, your spirit will splinter, and your mind will scream that it's over. But if there's something left, some ember of defiance buried inside you, then you'll know what you're really made of. If you dig deep and find the will to survive, you'll know it's possible to survive anything in life, including an outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.